Welcome to Moneyweb at Midday, the actuality news show, offering unique insights and in-depth analysis, featuring South Africa's top business leaders, newsmakers, and analysts for today's professionals. Your host, Jeremy Maggs.
Hello, and thank you for listening to Moneyweb at Midday. In the next 30 minutes, I'll put some context around the numbers, perspective around the politics, some clarity around the choices facing us in South Africa. A warm welcome. I'm Jeremy Maggs. Coming up on the program today, threatened with arrest for leaving your driver's license at home. We separate police powers from roadside intimidation in a special extended investigation. Cryptocurrency is shrinking as Sars gains a clearer view of local and offshore transactions. And can South Africa reclaim its position as the gateway for investment between India and Africa? It's Thursday, the 30th of July. A routine traffic stop became a frightening experience for one motorist when he was threatened with arrest because he did not have his physical driver's license with him. Now, we know this person's identity, but he has asked us to withhold his name. And he joins us now to explain what happened and why the encounter left him confused about both his rights and the powers of the officers involved. So welcome and thank you very much for joining us. You were threatened with arrest. What happened and what exactly did the officer say?
Thank you so much. Yesterday in the morning, around 9 o'clock in Pretoria and Gezina, I get stopped at a traffic light. So I make a turn and immediately I see two blue lights behind me. It's two gentlemen in balaclavas on motorbikes. And my worry now is, why am I being stopped just randomly for turning? So immediately I comply, I find a safe spot, I quickly park, the officer pulls to my right and says, "Sir, are you aware you actually skipped a red robot?" That's where the incident starts. And I say, "What do you mean, a red robot? I stopped and I just turned." He says, No, you actually took off before it turned green." And I said, okay, here comes a bit of trouble, but nonetheless, I'm late for a meeting, so let me compose myself and not, almost like get into an altercation. So I simply say, okay, officer, if that is the case, you are the interpreter of the situation. I do apologize. However, maybe it's because I am in a bit of a rush and I maybe have faulted by skipping the red robot, as you say. So I'm really just trying to comply here. Given my incidents with police in the past, I know that once the matter gets aggravated, you are on the back foot throughout the entire discussion. Now the interesting part comes. The officer says, "Sir, I need your driver's license." And immediately, to my panic, I was stopped in a roadblock yesterday, so I know for a fact my driver's license is on me. I look for it in my wallet, it's not there. I look for it in the cabbie, I don't see it. I look for it in my little handbag, it's not there. Immediately, I'm getting agitated. Okay, calm down. Look in the car. I say, "Officer, please just bear with me for 2 minutes. I just need to tell my colleague that I am running late for a meeting. I told them I'm turning the corner and I'm literally down the road. So let me just inform them." He pulls and says to me, "Okay, so it's okay, do that." Quickly, I pull out my phone, boom, I text my colleague, "Listen, I'm on the way. I've been stopped by cops." I leave it at that. I continue looking for the license. After frisking the car, Jeremy, literally in panic for about now close to 4 to 5 minutes of just searching the car, below the seats, everything. I go to the passenger seat and then immediately I say, you know what? Actually, there's no need for me to go into this frenzy. Let me give him my ID. So I produce my ID. I hand it over to him. I say, "Sir, unfortunately, I can't find my license, but due to time constraints, could I please ask that you take my ID and you check my license? It's valid. I don't have traffic infringements. I don't have a suspended license. I just happen not to have it in person." What does the officer say? The officer says, "Sir, are you aware of the new ATO rules?" I'm saying, "Which one? The demerit system?" He says, "No, the demerit system is on pause." I say, "I'm very much aware of the demerit system and aware that it's being rolled out in specific municipalities. However, it's been put forward for next year." So now, Jeremy, mind you, I think I can consider myself to be a bit of a well-informed South African citizen who complies with the law. In my profession, I deal a lot with public safety campaigns and all of these nature of interpreting policy law to simplify messaging to ordinary South Africans, right? So now I'm in a bit of a tizz. He says, are you aware that due to the new auto rules, when I stop you and you don't have your license on you, it is a offense? I say, an offense? What do you mean by offense? He says, so his colleague then pulls out the book, and both of them come to me and say, you see this highlighted section, what driver's license code do you have? I say, it says great code 10. He says, if that's the case, sir, so the fines on the infringements for other stuff has gone up, but the most critical one in this moment is that I need to make an arrest. An arrest, so please make it make sense. For what exactly? He says, no, the rule here says, you see on these columns, it shows me on the book, some other charges have infringement, some others have offense. If it's written offense, we must make an immediate arrest and take you to the police station. I said, sir, in not to order argue with you, but do you think that is the right interpretation of the law? That you need to arrest me for not having a license in person, which is valid and you can actually validate on the phone? He says, you know what, sir, unfortunately, I'm in a position where from our training, this is what we've been told. I said, what kind of training are you referring to? He says, no, we were actually in training about 2 weeks ago and we raised this thing. Look, mind you, to the credit of the cop, he was not abrasive and he was not agitated, like trying to be aggressive. He was simply just saying, this is my interpretation, this is my understanding, and we both have to make an arrest, and therefore, can you please start to make arrangements? Immediately, I take my phone, Jeremy, I take a video to my colleague. I say, colleagues, I am actually getting arrested by the cops for not having my license on me, and I'm in a bit of a panic, but I don't know, maybe I'll call a lawyer. Then I hang up. I say, you know what? Perhaps conversations will also just inform me more about what is leading to this misfortunate position. Don't want to call a lawyer. It's going to cause a scene. Sir, how can we best make this thing, clear for me so that I know when I get to the police station, what am I going to be charged with, so I can inform the person who maybe may need to come fetch my car? Am I going to be detained? What is the procedure? He says, sir, to be quite honest, if I have to take it to the police station, the police then, I'll hand you over, they'll have to process and take it from there. Now, immediately, a few things then come to mind, Jeremy. One, I think any unlawful arrest immediately traumatizes me, having been in altercations with the cops, but just generally knowing the kind of temperature that, is experienced by South Africans. I said to the policeman, sir, are you not supposed to be serving and protecting rather than keep creating fear and intimidation? Because for me, that's really the position I always ask with the police. I find that sometimes it gives them a bit of a jerk reaction to go into drastic punitive measures, unlike resolving through dialogue and conversation. I said, I don't want to miss work. I don't want to end up with a reputation damage. I don't want to be in a financial loss dealing with lawyers in relation to the situation. How can we make this thing sensible to me so I can relay it to the next person and know what position I've gotten myself into? He says we pushed back ourselves as the people who need to carry this thing out. And I've found myself in a position where I've dealt with motorists who are not aware of the fact that the law has changed. I said, but what information has been sent out to the public about what you are saying? He says, no. We ordinarily tell people, like now when I have to make this arrest on the side of the road, red flag number 3. I mean, why is this no public education about such things, So immediately, Jeremy, the situation escalated very quickly. 28 minutes later, the cop says to me, sir, you know what? I just feel like the next thing I have to go to court, and then I have to find myself having to prove the fact that you didn't have your license. And if you now deny, I must now, he just says, you know what? So here's your ID. Good luck with your meeting. You can carry on. That's literally the only thing that allowed me to continue with my trip 30 minutes later, purely because the guy felt like, one, he doesn't want to go to court for something that is not provable in law. And I said, if I come to court and I produce my license, I say, I had it on the day. It was just in my seat. What then do we do? And then that just became, I think, the one thing that almost saved the day. But essentially, that's the discussion.
Thank you very much indeed. Now to what the law actually says. Motorists are required to carry their driver's license, but forgetting the card at home is not the same as never being licensed. There's also considerable confusion over whether an officer can arrest a driver, whether the license can be checked electronically, and whether there is a 24-hour period in which to present the card at a police station. I want to get some clarity now on what officers can and cannot do and what recourse our motorist now has. I'm joined in that respect by Road Traffic Infringement Authority spokesperson Monde Mkalipi. So Monde, must a motorist carry the physical license card every time they drive?
Yes, Jeremy. I think let's please make this point quite clear. In terms of Schedule 3 of the ARTO regulations, we have like Charge 1710 that says if a motorist operated a motor vehicle whilst he or she did not keep a driving license or a document or any other prescribed authorization in the said vehicle, that is an infringement, and that warrants a 1,000 rands fine. But perhaps let's also create a distinction here, Jeremy. There is also another regulation or a charge that says it's 1707. That says if a motorist operated a motor vehicle without a driving license issued to him or her, or any document deemed to be a driving license, then that becomes an offense. So there are two things here. The first one, the one that I indicated, is we have a motorist not having a driving license in his possession or her possession while operating a vehicle. That remains an infringement, because in this instance, you have a motorist who has been issued with a driving license, but at that point in time, he or she does not have it in his or her possession. That remains an infringement. But if the driving license was never issued, that is an offense. Then the person needs to be arrested on the spot. So in this particular case of the motorist that we have interviewed earlier on, the gentleman does indicate quite clearly well that he does have his driving license, but he unfortunately does not have it in the vehicle at that time. But he is able to prove that he has got positive form of identification that traffic officers or police can use to check on the system if indeed he or she does have the driving license. So we have to be able to create that distinction, Jeremy, to say if it was never issued and it cannot be proven that it was ever issued, then that becomes an offense. It is the person need to be arrested. So in this instance, the poor gentleman, what should have been happened here is that because he insists that he does have it, but not in his possession at that time, then the officers should have perhaps checked on the system. Yes, indeed, you do have it, but we are still going to issue you with a 1,000 rand fine, which he can still go forward and still dispute it. But of course, perhaps it might not be a winnable matter, because the law says the driving license must be in your possession at the time you operate the vehicle, at the time you are stopped by the police or any officer of the law. So we should be able to create those two matters here, Jeremy.
In this particular case, did the officer either overreach or misinterpret the regulation by threatening arrest?
I think because these regulations, Jeremy, are relatively new, and I think it's quite important that we, as the Road Traffic Infringement Authority, do embark on a quite an intensive public education drive that involves our own officers, so that we are able to interpret these regulations quite accurately. So perhaps in a way there was a bit of a misinterpretation of the regulation, especially if the motorist is saying, yes, I do have it, but not, unfortunately, I can't find it at the moment. Because what could have happened, they could have checked if perhaps they had interpreted the regulation quite accurately to say, well, let us check. If you do have it, but not in your possession at this time, then we're going to issue with a fine. Not to say, if you don't have it in your possession, then you are facing arrest. That is an incorrect interpretation of the regulation in this instance.
And in this particular case, would it also have been up to the officer's discretion just to let that person go?
Yes, it is quite important that they do use their discretion, but at the same time, I think they should really stick to their role of enforcing the law. Because if a person does not have the driving license, and I think perhaps it should not have been stressed this much, because all that could have happened here was they could have just issued the gentleman with an infringement notice instead of threatening him to take him to the police station or with an arrest. They could have just issued him with a 1710 charge fine, and then he goes. Because we can say that, well, we do need to ensure that we engage deeper. But I think what you can also indicate, Jeremy, these regulations and these charges are still undergoing a review, because ARTO, its expansion now, is a relatively new phenomenon, as you have just indicated now a few weeks ago, that we're expanding it to other municipalities. So there is a process that is underway to review these regulations so that they are not open to misinterpretation. They are also not open to abuse by anyone who is supposed to enforce them on the roads.
Do you think this particular incident was an isolated case, or have you heard of other similar experiences?
Well, when we're going through these regulations, I think there needs to be a few isolated incidences that we also need to look at. That's why we are saying there is a process of reviewing some of these regulations so that they are not open to any form of misinterpretation by those our colleagues who are supposed to enforce them. So it might not necessarily be an isolated incident. There could be few of them popping up around perhaps the municipalities where the RTO is being implemented. And I think it's a matter that we are looking at, as I've just said now, that we are reviewing some of these to ensure that there is accurate interpretation and implementation of these charges by our officers on the road.
Mondi Mkalipi speaks for the Road Traffic Infringement Authority. Thank you very much indeed.
You're listening to Moneyweb at Midday.
Now, if you think your crypto activity is hidden from the taxman, think again. South Africa's new crypto asset reporting framework gives South African revenue far greater visibility of transactions across local and international platforms, while a new draft tax guide spells out how it intends treating crypto gains and income. Someone who has applied his mind to this is Nico Tron, who is founder of Unicus Tax Specialists. Nico, warm welcome to you. Crypto anonymity for South African taxpayers, is it effectively over?
Yes, one could say that it is effectively over. There's unprecedented insight into or visibility over cryptos, not only locally but internationally. And so therefore, the argument that SARS won't see it or won't know about it is really no longer effective or useful.
So what information then can SARS now obtain that it might not have seen before?
Well, I think that SARS now, they would have seen the information before, but the manner of getting it would have been a little bit more difficult because they would have had to operate through or via the taxpayer or via specific requests to, for example, exchanges. But SARS will get transaction details of cryptos directly now from exchanges. In the same way as a bank reports to SARS how much interest you earned, an exchange will now report to SARS how much cryptos you sold, say for argument's sake, and what your gains and losses were on those transactions.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, this would apply to transactions on offshore exchanges as well as foreign wallets, right?
Indirectly, it would, because this is an international framework. You would have, for example, the IRS, say, to use an example, HMRC, would have adopted a similar framework, and HMRC will have a reporting obligation to SARS to the extent they have data of South African tax residents. So though the reporting obligation in our domestic law does not extend per se to all foreign exchanges, certain ones do, but does not extend per se, because this is an international movement, if you will, there will be insight from SARS into offshore exchanges as well.
So just clear this one up for me. Which specific transactions then would trigger tax? Would it be selling, swapping, spending, staking, or merely just holding crypto, or all of that?
So I think holding crypto in and of itself should not trigger a tax bill, and that's where SARS's draft guide becomes very important, because SARS has now come out and said, for these sorts of transactions, this is how we think the tax should be calculated, or at least how the tax should be determined. And really, if you sell a crypto, if you exchange one for another, that's a barter transaction, that's a disposal event. Certainly, there seems to be still among some taxpayers the misperception that the tax bill only falls once it's converted into fiat currency, which is not the case. Barter transactions do give rise to tax consequences. What those tax consequences would be depends on whether or not you are speculating in cryptos or whether you're holding them as a capital investment. That, of course, then drives whether it's taxed as revenue at 45%, call it marginal tax rate, or whatever the taxpayer's marginal tax rate is, or at the lowest CGT rate. Staking, for example, is another thing that they look at. Mining is another thing they look at in particular. And their view, as I read their note or their draft guide, is that those things The gains you make out of staking and mining are designedly sought and worked for, and so therefore the gains would constitute revenue receipts taxable as normal income tax.
Would there be some confusion then around whether SARS decides whether a gain is taxable as income or simply a capital gain?
I think the issue of capital versus revenue has been around for years, and each case will have to be determined on its own facts and circumstances. The guide at least tells us how SARS interprets particular sets of transactions, for example, staking and mining and crypto swaps, and even using crypto to buy for assets. But that doesn't make it the law. It is unfortunately an area that is prone to disputes and disagreements between capital or revenue, and I think it's not new to cryptos. It's just an ongoing issue that will always be there for as long as we don't have definitive capital and revenue rules like we do, for example, for certain shares.
Nico, could frequent trading turn what someone regards as an investment then into taxable revenue, given that people do trade frequently on these platforms?
Potentially, yes. One of the tests that have developed in our law to determine the capital or revenue nature, not in and of itself conclusive per se, but certainly persuasive and indicative of a revenue intent, is the frequency of your transactions. If you have a high frequency of transactions, that is indicative of a speculative intent and a system that is designed to maximize profit, like a trade, like a business. And in the circumstances, that would likely yield revenue results taxable as such.
Would declaring crypto for the first time make me more likely then to face an audit, do you think?
Yeah, I think the reality is that if you think about it logically, of course, we don't know how SARS's algorithms and risk systems work exactly.
Yeah.
But logically thinking, if you were to declare R1 million worth of crypto on your tax return today, the question is, well, how did you get the money to buy the cryptos that you sold in this year for the first time? Where is this coming from? And so in my experience as a dispute resolution expert, this is typically how historic non-compliance is found, because taxpayers, understandably so, wants to draw a line in the sand and say, listen, I'll just declare from this year onwards. But the reality is those things do tend to raise questions, and SARS does then tend to extrapolate that finding historically and backwards. And so declaring it for the first time, I think, does run that risk of a verification or audit, because it's something new on a tax return that has not ever been declared before.
And Nico, just a final question. The best advice I ever got from my late father was always hang on to every single document. What records must taxpayers produce then if they've traded through several exchanges or maybe even lost access to an old wallet, which does happen?
Well, I think the reality is I don't think there's a definitive list. I think the important point is to heed your father's advice to say just keep everything, because at the end of the day, the onus of proof is on the taxpayer to prove that a certain tax treatment follows or that a certain profit is arrived at by deducting certain expenses. And so there are tools out there that I've seen in practice that people use to consolidate and build income statements, if you will. But the reality is I think keep as much of the documents as you can. And unfortunately, there are instances, and we deal with voluntary disclosure programs often, there are instances where there's historic issues and the documentary evidence isn't there. That is a problem. The best way to fix that problem, in my experience, is through the voluntary disclosure program, to the extent it's available, because at least there, reasonable estimates may be acceptable in certain circumstances, whereas if you enter into a dispute or SARS finds it and they call on you to prove something which you cannot prove, you're in trouble. Although, having said that, documents on their own is not necessarily the only thing that can prove something. In tax disputes, it's a balance of probabilities thing. Yes, the absence of documents will make it more difficult to prove your case, but it doesn't mean you have no case.
Nico Taron, thank you very much indeed, founder of Unicus Tax Specialists. I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Moneyweb at midday for all your up-to-date stories.
South Africa wants to position itself as a key gateway for investment between India and the rest of Africa, but it faces growing competition from centres like Mauritius, Kenya, and I think also the United Arab Emirates. I want to talk now to Craig Lyle, who's head of fund structuring and solutions at the international financial and corporate services company Amicor, about where investment is flowing, what's holding it back, and whether South Africa still has a genuine competitive advantage. And I would sense the jury might be out on that one. Craig, a very warm welcome to you. So let me ask you bluntly, does South Africa genuinely remain Africa's investment gateway, or is it starting to lose ground to centres like Mauritius and the UAE?
Jeremy, I honestly believe that South Africa still has a very strong advantage. South Africa has got the deep capital markets, we've got the sophisticated financial sector, and we've certainly got strong professional services. At the same time, remember, Africa has got 1.6 or 1.7 billion people. I would certainly say that that is a market that is far too large for only one gateway into Africa. So I believe that Mauritius, Kenya, and the UAE play a very important role. I think the key is for South Africa to remain the leading hub, which certainly Amicor believes that it is.
How do we do that without losing advantage then to those other two centres who, let's be honest, are fairly assertive in their own strategies?
Yes, Jeremy, they certainly are. Look, South Africa has the second highest number of daily flights between the UAE and our country. That's both between Cape Town and Johannesburg, and that's second only to Egypt. And that's roughly 20 flights a day. If we use that as a stat, Kenya and Mauritius are well behind that. So the amount of business travel, the amount of tourism that we have is a very key indicator on how strong our market still is. We are one of the few markets in South Africa, or the few countries in Africa that have the sophisticated financial center, that have the strong professional services, and also the capital markets that I mentioned. There's very few that have all three. So for this time, it's about keeping the growth, keeping the strength within South Africa.
And as far as that India-Africa investment corridor is concerned, where is capital currently flowing? So,
Jeremy, as an example, a couple of weeks ago, we had the Indian African Entrepreneurship and Investment Summit hosted in our beautiful city in Cape Town. And I must say that we really put on a very good show. The turnout to the conference was really mind-blowing in terms of the number of decision makers, entrepreneurs, business leaders from South Africa, from our neighbors, and of course from India. Amicor itself hosted a side event. We had a lunch where we had, I think initially we invited around 60 key individuals, and of that we had to open up to around 100. The demand is significant, and the capital flow is there. We have a very high Indian population of non-resident Indians residing in South Africa that would like to invest back into India, and at the same time, which is more important for South Africa, there is a significant interest from India into the South African market.
That's good news, but what do you think the biggest obstacles are preventing more Indian capital from reaching African business? Where's the risk?
Sure. Jeremy, I think the very clear barrier that everyone seems to name is certainly uncertainty. I think the real barrier is access. We know about the high degree of political and economic uncertainty. We know about the currency risk. But I think our binding constraint is actual access to opportunities. And that's really where Amicor is trying to focus. And that is one of our strengths is in terms of building transparent investment structures for our clients that enable them to access what would somewhat be illiquid opportunities, maybe in minerals, in mining, in agriculture. And we are able to allow family offices, high net worth corporations, institutions to access those opportunities.
But you'll agree with me that a lot of investment is lost because African regulation as it stands at the moment is still fragmented. And in many cases, and let's be honest here, it is unpredictable.
Yes, you are correct. But good regulation I believe, is a selling point rather than a speed bump. And that's really the reason why we chose to go down the route of being regulated in South Africa. And I think we need to work closely with our regulators across borders in order to try and align and fine-tune between South Africa and between our neighbors.
And in that respect, the continent also needs to strengthen controls, I guess, against money laundering without frightening away legitimate investment. Again, South Africa just recently coming off that grey list.
Absolutely, and quite a significant advantage for South Africa. Amicorp itself, Jeremy, operates across. I think we are now have over 40 offices in over 30 countries. And being a global financial service provider, this is the AML is one of our main objectives in terms of monitoring and managing. And I think we are confident in terms of the processes, the policies, and the procedures that we're able to implement as a global financial player, that the regulators and the jurisdictions are able to monitor and to manage. So we work very closely with the regulators in all of the jurisdictions, and we're doing the same through Africa to keep improving.
Craig Lyle, thank you very much indeed. Head of Fund Structuring and Solutions at the International Financial and Corporate Services Company, Amicorp. And on that note, we will end today's program. You've been listening to Moneyweb at Midday. We are here every weekday at noon with the latest in current affairs, the economy and policy. You can always catch the podcast version a little later. Thank you for making us part of your day. Until next time, goodbye.
Listen to the daily live stream of Moneyweb at midday or download episodes on moneyweb.co.za, the Moneyweb app, Apple Podcasts and Spotify, or follow Moneyweb News on social media for more updates. Moneyweb, your trusted source for business and investment insights.